Chris, let me thank you once again for joining us after yesterday. We're starting to get some more opinions about how long a grounding could last. Some analysts on the sell side argue 3 to 6 months to get eventual certification. Does that make sense?
Well, that's a real good question because this is uncharted territory. We have never before in the U.S. had a grounding for any reason other than a catastrophic mechanical failure that the pilot could not fix in the moment. And the two groundings that I'm thinking of were the DC-10 in Chicago when the engine separated from the wing in 1979, and the 787, the Boeing 787 in 2013 when they were having lithium-ion battery fires. So those are events that are disabling to the airplane. There's nothing the pilot can do about it in the moment, and those were obvious reasons for grounding. Here we've got a very different scenario. We've got automation that is usually reliable, but occasionally it fails, and sometimes when it fails, a small percentage of the pilots don't know how to respond to it properly. We know other pilots did respond to it properly. A small percentage doesn't. That raises a good question about what's the bright line that says you need to ground, and then what's the bright line that says you need to unground. So in terms of how long is it going to take, there isn't any. This is new uncharted territory. There isn't any bright line for grounding. We've already done that, and now we're looking, is there a bright line for ungrounding? The answer to that is no. There is no bright line for ungrounding. How do you do that when this is automation that rarely fails, and when it does fail, occasionally a small percentage of the pilots don't handle it properly?
So, Chris, in light of that, I mean, if we're in uncharted territory and the bright line in terms of when this could end is not yet clear, how long could we be talking about here in terms of the process to determine when and whether these planes are safe again?
That's anybody's guess at this point because it depends on at least two things. One is fixing the software itself to make it more human-friendly, if you will. The other is training of the pilots who are going to deal with this software. It's not just an equipment situation, it's an equipment/human situation. So you need to address both the human side and the equipment side. So that's a good question. How long will it take for both of those things to happen to some degree of satisfaction? What is that degree of satisfaction? We don't know that. There is no bright line on this one.
Joe, the story has been developing quickly. We went from Boeing saying these are fine to fly to just hours later yesterday, and the airlines too, to Boeing yesterday saying, hey, we're totally fine with this grounding now. What are the risks and the issues that you see from a corporate and investor perspective here, if indeed this is a problem with the way Boeing has engineered the plane, and if some of these planes are going to be out of service for a period of months?
Sure. Yeah. No. That's definitely the right question to be asking, and obviously we won't speculate as to the causes behind the accident, where everybody's waiting for more information. We do know that Boeing was working on a software fix after the Lion Air incident in October that they had planned to roll out to operators in the coming weeks ahead of a planned FAA airworthiness directive in April. It is unclear now if any new or incremental information discovered over the course of this investigation changes the remediation timeline for Boeing. In other words, do they have to go back and make incremental changes to the fixes that they were already working on? I think it's important to note the way that the airline stocks are trading here, that it suggests that the market doesn't think that this is going to be a huge impact in the near term. But obviously the big question is the question that was just raised a minute ago, is, the duration is uncertain.
Why are most of these airline stocks higher, especially Southwest, which is up more than 1% right now and has the most of these MAX aircraft in its fleet?
Right, and you've noted correctly on the program a number of times that Southwest does have the biggest exposure in the U.S., but even then it's 4.5% of their in-service fleet today. It's maybe 5% of their first half seat capacity. And so Southwest is also at a disadvantage, being primarily a point-to-point carrier compared with American Airlines and United Airlines that also operate the airplane. They have a little bit less flexibility in how they can reaccommodate passengers, but the big picture is that airlines do have some flexibility here.
But I guess, are the stocks trading higher because investors think you're taking capacity offline and that's going to be good for prices? I
think that's part of the reason why. Whether that actually comes to fruition or not is a bigger question. It's not clear that it is going to be a massive boon to industry pricing. But generally speaking, we are talking about 1 or 2 points of capacity in the United States that is being flown by 737 MAX aircraft. And investors obviously always tend to think, less capacity is always better.
Chris, as we're talking, the president, in a public appearance, says that he hopes the planes are grounded for only a short time, hopes that Boeing figures out the problem, says that the company's under great pressure. These black boxes are going to Paris, not to the NTSB. What will you be looking for in terms of how they process the early information?
Well, the first thing you'll be looking for is what kinds of similarities and dissimilarities are there between this one and the Lion Air crash, because the Lion Air crash was really the reason for this. We don't know yet enough about the Ethiopian crash to be able to draw any conclusions from it. But we're going to be, they'll be looking closely at what did the software do, what did the pilots do in response, and all those kinds of issues, the same issues they'll be looking at in Lion Air to see to what extent are they similar, what extent are they different.
Chris, wondering, yesterday before the latest information about the satellite tracking data was out, you didn't agree with the idea that the planes should be grounded. Have you changed your position on that? And then also, what is the precedent that this grounding sets in your mind?
I haven't changed my position. It's just that I'm nervous about entering new territory when we don't know where it's going to take us. It's going to be an interesting journey. Times they have changed. Times will keep changing. It's going to be an interesting journey to be grounding an airplane for a reason other than a catastrophic mechanical failure that is a single point failure that a pilot can't fix in the moment. In this situation, the pilot can fix it in the moment if the pilot is properly trained, and that's one of the things the NTSB will be exploring, is to what extent were pilots trained about this. And I'm hearing that a lot of pilots said, I knew nothing about it, so I'm sure the NTSB will be looking into not only the software but also the pilots, to what extent were they trained about it. So it's just the fact that we're going into new territory that I'm concerned about.
Yeah, you're referring to some reporting quoting pilots who were briefed by Boeing in the early days of the new model that they didn't get sufficient information, and according to them, the response from Boeing was, well, we didn't want to inundate you with a bunch of new data sets.
Right, and so it's very interesting that we do have reports that pilots were challenged with this system, but most of them came through successfully, but yet the pilots were not clamoring for grounding the airplane. So they're the ones who are the real experts on what should we do here, and they didn't clamor for grounding. So to me, that was a reason to think, okay, maybe this is not an appropriate situation for grounding, because this is not a catastrophic mechanical failure that the pilots can't fix in the moment.
Gentlemen, stay with us. We're going to bring in Kayla Tausche, who's down in D.C. with more on these comments from President Trump. Kayla.
Hey, Morgan. Well, the president, in an expanded pool spray, is making comments about Brexit, making comments about Boeing. He said that as far as Brexit goes, he says it's a tough negotiation going on, that the U.S. will stay in its lane, and that he wasn't necessarily in favor of Brexit, just that he thought it would pass. On Boeing, Carl just mentioned the comments that the president made. He said that they're in a very tough situation, but that the right decision was made. And then on the widening Democratic field in 2020, asked about Beto O'Rourke and the recent decision that he has just announced to run for the nomination for the Democratic candidate in 2020. He said, whoever it is, I'll take him on. So that spray is currently ongoing. We could have more headlines from the president. We'll bring them to you when we have them.
All right, Kayla, thank you for that. Joe, turning back to Boeing specifically right now, you've had some airlines come out and basically say, across the globe, come out and say basically that the costs inflicted from this, they're going to turn to Boeing to look to get reimbursement. Right. Is that something they will be able to do?
Unclear. That is one of the major unanswered questions, aside from obviously the duration of the grounding. That and whether or not airlines and lessors, for that matter, are going to continue to accept deliveries from Boeing while the fleet is grounded. Obviously, it's a much bigger, much more important question for a Boeing investor than it is for airlines, but there is a cost associated with having to continue to take on those assets and not being able to deploy them in a revenue-generating fashion. So the answer is we simply don't know at this point, but we expect that the airline's position is going to be that, yes, they will seek some compensation from the manufacturer for any disruption, and I expect that they'll also refuse to accept deliveries while the fleet is grounded.
So they'll continue to make almost 2 a day, or 52 a month?
Right.
And if deliveries all are halted, do they keep that up?
My expectation is that Boeing will maintain the production rates to minimize the supply chain disruption. And they'll just have to carry that inventory on their balance sheet for a little while longer, and then you'll eventually have a big working capital unwind. But Boeing obviously has the balance sheet to be able to do that. But it's probably far less disruptive